We are so excited to have you with us here today for the fourth in a series of virtual conversations sponsored by the Folger Institute's consortium universities. I'm Owen Williams, Associate Director for Scholarly Programs, and on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to welcome you to What is Revolution? The Institute sponsors research through fellowships and gathers scholars in programs that center historical evidence, while also acknowledging that the archive inevitably holds deliberate elisions and silences. In so doing, the Institute brings together a community of scholars and researchers to use the Folger collections and each other's knowledge to open new subjects of inquiry and to include and cultivate more diverse voices in our narratives of the early modern world. In this What Is series, we host conversations among groups of scholars around early modern keywords that we believe are particularly resonant today. Our conversation today, What is Revolution, has been organized by Professor Stephen Pincus, who is Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of British History at the University of Chicago. Professor Pincus focuses on the history of Britain and its empire, comparative empires, and comparative revolutions. His second monograph, 1688, The First Modern Revolution, argued that the Glorious Revolution radically transformed the English state and society. His third monograph, The Heart of the Declaration, the founder's case for activist government, placed the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence in an imperial rather than proto-national context. Professor Pincus is currently working on two monographs, A Global History of the British Empire, circa 1650 to 1784, and Partners in Revolution, which compares the Irish Revolution of 1782 and the American Revolution. Before I hand things over to Professor Pincus, I would like to ask everyone to please keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentations and subsequent conversations among the presenters. You'll be welcome to turn your cameras back on during the questions and answer portion of our event and ask questions verbally if you'd like to. I invite you to send your questions at any time via the Zoom chat, and I will pose them to the presenters after the presentations and after a brief roundtable.
Well, welcome to the Folger Institute's virtual conversation on What is Revolution. The format for this afternoon is that each of our four terrific panelists will speak for about 10 minutes each, offering some reflections and provocative comments on revolution from their different areas of expertise and their different disciplinary backgrounds. I'll then ask them a couple of general questions to encourage them to explore points of contact and disagreement introduced in their remarks. Then we'll open up the conversation to the audience for questions and comments, and the main event will last for about 90 minutes, but then we'll move to a Zoom breakout room for a final half an hour intended for graduate students and early career scholars in the audience so that they can have a more intimate conversation with the panelists and explore more specialist questions. So before introducing our speakers, I wanted to talk about the importance and timeliness of an event thinking about revolution and perhaps say something about why the Folger is an excellent, though perhaps unlikely venue for this discussion. The term revolution has experienced a remarkable revival in popular discussion in the past decade or two. Various public commentators have described the actions of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Bibi Netanyahu in Israel, and Manuel López Obrador in Mexico as revolutionary. Others have said that Javier Milei in Argentina and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil are would-be revolutionaries. Still others have referred to Brexit, Britain's exit from the European Union, and Ukraine's future entry into the EU as revolutionary transformations. At the beginning of the decade, journalists, scholars, and the American Congress discussed the Arab Spring as revolution. Similarly, folks discussed the transformation of many post-Soviet polities as revolutionary. And, of course, there has been much discussion as to the revolutionary status of the events that took place in Washington on the 6th of January, 2020. All of these events provoke us to ask anew a series of vital questions. What is a revolution? What are the circumstances in which they break out? Can we predict revolutions? What are the expected outcomes of revolutions? Do revolutions achieve their aims? Do they lead to more or less participatory government? And how do we determine whether the aims and aspirations of politicians or social movements are in fact revolutionary? Of course, these are hardly new questions. In February 1968, for example, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing on exactly this subject. The star witness at that hearing, Harvard history professor Crane Brinton had published a book in 1938, 30 years before the hearing, called Anatomy of Revolution, in which he claimed that revolutions all had a similar life cycle. Revolutions, for Brinton, were best thought of as a disease in which the polity was first infected, then overcome, and eventually recovered from this microbial infection. Rapid change, Brinton concluded pessimistically, could not be achieved through revolution. Brinton's work was extremely influential. It was sold in bookshops all over the world and is known to have informed a variety of policymakers. Nevertheless, Brinton's book is hardly read anymore. This is due, no doubt, in part because the book is now 3/4 of a century old. But in larger part, it is because his approach now seems dated. First, Brinton only examined what he called the Great Revolutions: the English Revolution of the 1640s, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution. He built his arguments on a remarkably narrow set of cases which he claimed all would accept in a kind of commonsensical manner were in fact revolutions. Second, Brinton was largely concerned with First World revolutions. Indeed, many questioned when Brinton testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee whether his analysis had any purchase whatsoever on the case of Vietnam, about which the committee was mostly concerned at the time. Third, Brinton assumed, along with many opponents of revolution, that real change could not occur through revolutionary action. Since Brinton's time, there has been much academic study of revolution. Scholars have broadened the number of cases studied. They have examined the geographical scope. They have expanded the geographical scope. And scholars have rejected the notion that revolutions could and did achieve very little in all cases. Broadly, academics have come up with three different kinds of accounts of revolution. First, the modernization theorists have argued that revolution happens when social and cultural changes so fundamentally transform a polity that its form of government is no longer deemed appropriate by most of its citizens or subjects. This line of argument was most famously developed by the Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington. But there are many who do not share Huntington's political convictions who have advanced versions of this story. Second, some scholars have advanced a class-based analysis of revolution. In this narrative, revolutions happen when the social or cultural status of one part of a society becomes so unbearable that they take up arms against the existing regime. Third, some scholars have argued that we have focused too much on what revolutionaries say about their motivations and their aims, arguing instead that if we really want to understand the causes and nature of revolutions, we should focus on broad structural changes in society and politics. One prominent version of this story, associated with the sociologist Jack Goldstone, is that demographic changes explain the geographical pattern and origins of revolution. Times and places that have rapid population growth are those which are most likely to find, in which we're most likely to find revolution. Events in the past several decades have placed pressure on all these interpretations. Who were the modernizers in the Iranian Revolution? Are Viktor Orban's aims more ethnic than class-based? How demographically unstable was Britain in the years before Brexit? Perhaps it is time to come up with new theories of revolution. Nevertheless, it strikes me that we don't have to begin from scratch. For example, it might make sense to return to Crane Brinton's notions that we should focus on the entire life cycle of revolutions, calling attention not only to the outbreak of revolutions, the implicit focus of most recent sophisticated theorizing, but to revolutionary processes and revolutionary outcomes. Perhaps it might also be useful to return to the English case in the way that many 18th century commentators did, thinking about England in the 17th century as a remarkably revolutionary society, one which underwent revolutionary change not in the year 1641 or in the year 1649, or even in the year 1688, but in the long period from the 1620s through the end of the 17th century. Did England have a century of revolution that produced innovation in culture, state, and society? The scholars here today all come at the question of revolution with different temporal and disciplinary specialties. Though all of them have written about England or Britain in different ways, let me now introduce our four panelists. Speaking first will be Jason Pesey, who's professor of history at University College London. Among Jason's many books are Print and Public Politics in the English Revolution, published by Cambridge in 2013, Politicians and Pamphleteers, Propaganda in the Civil Wars and Interregnum, Ashgate 2004, and most recently, The Madman and the Church Robber, Law and Conflict in Early Modern England, Oxford 2022. He is currently working on a project related to diplomatic culture in 17th century Europe. Jason is an editor of the premier monograph series in early modern British history at Manchester University Press and serves on numerous editorial boards. He is also a recent survivor of having been head of the history department at UCL. Speaking second will be Aisha Ramachandran, who's Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Yale University, where she has been recognized for her excellence in interdisciplinary teaching. Her prize-winning first book, The World Makers, published by the University of Chicago in 2015, charts transnational encounters and the early mechanisms of globalization from the 15th to the 18th centuries. Her current project, Lyric Thinking Towards a Global Poetics, is a transhistorical and multilingual exploration of the politics of poetic subjectivity. Speaking third will be Aaron Jakes, who's now Assistant Professor of Modern Middle Eastern History at the University of Chicago. His prize-winning first book, Egypt's Occupation, published by Stanford in 2020, explores both the political economy of the Egyptian state and the role of political economic thought in the struggle over British rule in Egypt following the occupation of 1882. Aaron has a number of current projects, among which is what will be his second monograph, Tilted Waters, The World the Suez Canal Made, exploring the many and shifting roles that the Suez Canal has played in the production of global inequalities. Finally, Julia Adams is the Margaret H. Marshall Professor of Sociology and the head of Grace Hopper College at Yale University. Adams's prize-winning first book, The Familial State, Ruling Families and Merchant Capitalism in Early Modern Europe, was published by Cornell in 2005. It's a must-read for anyone interested in state formation, capitalism, and empire. She has also edited 3 field-defining collections of essays and has won numerous article prizes. Adams has not only survived being chair of sociology and vice provost of the social sciences and diversity at Yale, she is also a past president of the Social Science History Association. And without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Jason.
Okay, thanks very much. So as Steve says, I'm a political historian of the mid-17th century Britain. And for us, revolution is a vital but difficult concept. There's been massive disagreement about the appropriateness of the term in terms of describing the events of the civil wars and interregnum, the severity, longevity of the crisis by which these events were preceded, the motives and intentions of the protagonists, the transformative nature of what emerged. All of that is contested. And so what I want to do is to try and navigate a path through those debates and suggest ways in which I think political historians have perhaps gone wrong and how we might do better at trying to understand revolutions. And in doing so, I kind of follow a few signposts from maybe wider scholarly landscape. The first point to make about that scholarly landscape is there's been a lot of recent work which is trying to demonstrate that the term revolution need not be regarded as anachronistic in 17th century context. That's important because there are those who stress and emphasize that revolution had there's a notion of revolution at the time in terms of what the word meant that was circular, things about restoring things, right? So it's restorative rather than unidirectional. The term, it turns out, we now realize much more clearly, could be used to denote fundamental change in forms of government, i.e. they understood revolution as we understand revolution. These events could be viewed positively or at least neutrally rather than simply negatively. And notwithstanding providential ideas about such changes being God's work, these events could be regarded as being promoted by conscious human behavior. Recognizably modern conceptualizations of revolution thus were evident not merely by 1688, but much earlier and perhaps as early as the mid or even early 16th century. So, but how far this gets us, it seems to me, is a bit unclear. However possible it was for contemporaries to use the term with conceptual clarity, they could do that they mostly did not do that. The term was mostly used very loosely. Even when the term was not being used to suggest circular motion, in other words, it was often used in the plural, revolutions, merely to, in a sense, denote turmoil, inversion, upheaval, kind of chaos, rather than something, a kind of process of disorder, rather than an outcome, a destination. And of course, we also then need to recognize that key early modern revolutions need to be regarded, as they were at the time, as both restorative and transformative at the same time, right? The Reformation is both of those things and pitched as such. The Restoration in 1660 is both restorative and involves change. And this also seems to me to be true for the mid 17th century. As such, our task really ought to be to grapple with the multifaceted nature of such events, as well as contemporary rhetoric and thinking. But a bigger issue, it seems to me, is that even here, what we get is something that involves a rather narrow definition of what constitutes a revolution, a political revolution. Rapid, violent overturning of political elites, regime change, in other words. That is how we think about political historians tend to think about revolution. This restricted sense is common from Thomas More onwards, and it is evident, as evident amongst historians as it is amongst social scientists. And of course, we see it really clearly in the work of Lawrence Stone, the historian who most obviously insisted on the revolutionary nature of the mid 17th century, at least in the second half of the 20th century. Stone probed the nature of a variety of revolutions with considerable rigor, it seems to me, but the focus on regime change, actual or intended, resulted in what seems to me to be a problematic discussion of causes. We immediately go, we split from revolutionary events as turmoil, regime change, and then everything that isn't that is somehow cause or some kind of cause. Any such discussion of the conditions that generated political upheaval might raise concerns about the myth of origins, how we distinguish between preconditions and precipitants of regime change, and how these things are more or less driven by time, i.e. things that are proximate to or further away from the events under scrutiny. There is a risk of kind of listing relevant factors that are somehow relevant without calibrating what role they played. The danger is we include things that are likely to have had some sort of effect somehow, but it all becomes a bit nebulous. Problems arise in terms of the relationship between correlation and causality, things that correlate with regime change, but how do we think about causality? These are all massively problematic areas, and it seems to me that that's why historians have found themselves bedeviled by controversy over these kind of things. Crucially, therefore, it seems to me that we can profitably think about revolution in other ways, and indeed do that by thinking about how other people think about other revolutions in the early modern period. We think about, somebody says, it seems to me we can retain the idea of a concern with long-term and short-term dynamics, what Stone wanted. We can think about the speed of revolution, the breadth of relevant issues, without, while insisting that we should focus much more intently on the conscious and deliberate actions and the knowing behavior by political actors. And on those dimensions of Stone's analysis that involve changing attitudes. Attitudes seem to me to be crucial. Let's home in on that. But without limiting ourselves, as Stone did, to kind of revolutionary ideologies or even antagonistic political inclinations. So I think it's right to focus on attitudes rather than other types of cause, but not to then limit ourselves to ideologies. And it seems to me we can do that without falling into any kind of deterministic trap, overplaying the inevitability of regime change. It seems to me this might be thought to involve the territory between preconditions and political tumults, or if you like, different kinds or orders of revolution. And it can involve, it seems to me, a picture of long-term multi-dimensional revolution, or rather a set of interlocking revolutions. It need not simply involve semantics. We're not merely rebranding things as revolutions that were once seen as causes. Or it doesn't necessarily mean, it need not mean collapsing preconditions into revolutions. And it seems to me that one way we can do this involves actually returning to something like administrative history. I think there are lots of ways of doing it. One kind of interesting way for me is returning to administrative history, and even to Geoffrey Elton's much now derided notion of a Tudor revolution in government, in terms of the actions, policies, processes of specific regimes. So Elton's Tudor Revolution debate became overblown and horrible. The tone was nasty, and it's put everybody off. It seems to me, the notion of the invention of a national bureaucratic government. We can get beyond that. It seems to me that we should resist the temptation to throw the conceptual baby out with the evidential and methodological bathwater. Crucially, Elton, it seems to me, insisted that administrative reforms can be deemed to be revolutionary. That is a political revolution, even if it is necessary to acknowledge that there were signs of earlier change, and even if further developments happen subsequently. His criteria included rapidity and volume of change, the deliberate application, as he said, of new approaches across different aspects of governmental activity, and of course, famously, a clear-minded protagonist, Thomas Cromwell. The point is not so much, it seems to me, whether Elton was right about the 1530s, the detail, as whether his notion of revolution, of what constitutes a political revolution, has value. And it seems to me that it does. Such instincts and approaches make it possible to label any number of regimes, Charles I, James II, as well as those of the mid-17th century, as revolutionary regimes before regime change happens. Financial exactions, centralizing tendencies, these are political revolutions. Secondly, it seems to me we can then think about other subdisciplinary fields. And it's striking how political revolution is defined so narrowly as something abrupt and so on. When we think about scientific revolutions in completely different registers, we think about the Industrial Revolution in completely different register, and we think about the print revolution or the informational revolution in completely different registers. So Elizabeth Eisenstein famously recognized that revolution can mean circular, can mean abrupt kind of regime change, but then insisted that we also need to think about what she called prolonged, irreversible, cumulative processes with effects that become ever more pronounced the longer they go on. Clearly able to distinguish such revolutions from preconditions, so we're not just collapsing something in one thing into another, and vitally recognize the possibility of connecting different revolutions, including political upheavals. But political upheavals are only one kind of revolution. So these three insights, it seems to me, incorporate administrative change. There could be others. Incorporate administrative change, long revolutions, and the multiplicity of connected revolutions can usefully combined and developed in relation to what I would say we need, a broader conceptualization of what constitutes politics and thus of political revolutions. Profound shifts in human thinking or mentalities. And here, actually, I found it useful to go back to Raymond Williams and Raymond Williams's notion of a long revolution. Looking beyond, as he did, antagonistic, oppositional, and revolutionary thinking. Those things are fine, but we can look beyond them. Or indeed, the kind of generalized skepticism, the kind of corrosion of authority that Stone drew attention. This involves, for Williams, thinking about a revolution that involves changes in behavior associated with, but not caused by, political, administrative, technological developments, and that betray new attitudes. Williams's revolution was long, uneven, complicated, but he appreciated the importance of correlating different revolutions, industrial and democratic in his case. And he posited a cultural revolution, which involved transforming, as he said, men and institutions and relations between individuals and society. Crucially, he recognized the need to scrutinize systems of behavior, his term, and attitudes by studying what he called the apparatus of common life. And that seems to me to make it possible to develop the notion of a political revolution that is constituted by what we might call, for example, a revolution in learning, or indeed an informational revolution, a mental reorientation that Elton actually conjured the notion of, but actually didn't develop because he was focused on something else. Learning and education are vital for Stone and Williams, but they think about that in the terms of the provision of formal education or the acquisition of literacy skills. Seems to me we can go way beyond that. And indeed re-engage with social historians who've explored the kind of experiences of authority. And we can think about those experiences of authority, participation in administrative political systems as being educative, politically educative. So we can think about, in other words, the politically educative effects of participation in administrative processes, new kinds of political behavior involved with novel forms of governance, happening over a long period. And here, again, you know, back in the early 60s, Williams, it seems to me, was innovative. He recognized the need to think about the press, newspapers, and so on, before Habermas and the public sphere was really thought about. We needed, in other words, he said, to challenge, what he said was the challenge was to probe the actions and thinking of engaged protagonists. Not least, it seems to me, in our context, in 17th century context, humble officials, voters, petitioners, for example. And what emerges from that, if we do that, it seems to me, what emerges is evidence that the conjunction of administrative, educational, and print revolutions constitutes a political revolution, marked by novel participatory opportunities, novel experiences, novel kinds of thoughtful and purposeful, if not necessarily theorized, political action, undertaken by members of a larger, more diverse political nation, people who are more attentive, aware, informed, engaged. And that behavior revealed new attitudes to authority, expectations about what could be achieved, how and by whom, notions about who needed to do what, ideas about where authority and responsibility lay. All of these things seem to me to be happening. Such changes in thinking and attitude, such changes in thinking and doing can be deemed revolutionary, even if they're not attended by, or indeed did not cause, political turmoil. More important is the possibility of recognizing that they contributed to a long political revolution, shifting more or less permanently the terms on which political life was conducted and debated. They might be combined with regime change, but they need not be in order to be thought of as a revolution. So the pathway, it seems to me, that emerges: revolutionary conjunctures, political revolutions that are multidimensional, multi-speed, and multi-phasal, educative processes and altered mentalities, is only partially discernible in recent scholarship. But it does seem to me to be present in the most exciting recent work in my field. And it seems to me to offer a kind of vital way of refreshing and reframing our understanding of early modern political revolutions. I'll stop there.
I am going to be offering a very different set of reflections coming from a different disciplinary perspective. As a literary critic and a cultural historian, I come to the question of revolution from a variety of different ways. So to start with the very basic question, what is revolution, which Jason offered us a kind of multi-dimensional approach to here. I'm going to start just lexically and semantically to remind us that revolution from the Latin literally means turning. And it asks us to think about the relationship between change, various forms of change, long-term change, and what we have come to understand as revolutionary. And I think in Jason's talk as well, this question of where is change as a process of transformation in various spheres intersect with our perhaps more modern notion of revolution is a question that I think this session as a whole today needs to attend to. So revolution is something characterized by circling back, by moving forward, by the notion of break and continuity in dialectic with each other. But my questions about revolution have to do with how do we bring it about intellectually and artistically, as well as what causes it. And here I want to talk perhaps more at some length about the question of alternate mentalities and how do we come to bringing about these changes. So more specifically, I wanted to reflect a little bit on the relationship between what we might broadly call literature and the arts, or various forms of cultural media, and whether those forms of cultural life cause revolution, are caused by revolution, and what is the relationship between society in some sense, or socio-political change, and these other forms of human making that we broadly characterize as cultural objects. So I want to start really with some etymologies to kind of remind us that revolution, as we understand it now, is a uniquely 17th century concept. Revolution in English comes from the Old French, and it is used specifically to mean political change for the first time in 1615. It is used to mean a coup d'etat, quite literally, in 1636. And it comes to mean a change of government by violent means in 1680. It's used to mean geological change by Buffon in 1749, and is finally used to denote the French Revolution, La Révolution, in 1789. So there is a kind of tapestry here of French meaning that is absorbed into English over the course of the 17th century, as it is into German and Dutch. It's also worth pointing out that these notions of revolution as a turning back, as Jason talked to us about, it comes out of post-classical Latin and is already present as early as the 12th century. But the first political use of revolution in its political sense is in Italy in the 14th century, where rivoluzione, as used for the first time in Italian, comes to be associated with political thought. So we're looking at a period in which semantic change becomes an index of ways of thinking about forms of social and political change in a particular kind of sphere. And I think to notice that the meaning of revolution as a kind of sustained political action does not get secured in any European vernacular until the kind of late 17th, 18th century, also reminds us that the so-called Age of Revolutions in the 18th century marks a linguistic impact that is already being felt at the level of vocabulary across Europe. To move now to the question of literature and the arts and revolution, and what do we mean by the conjunction of those two things, and how revolution might signify in the cultural sphere, is to remember that strangely, this is not a 17th century idea. The conjunction of art and literature and revolution is, interestingly enough, an early 20th century idea and connected very closely to Marxist thought. So the first work we actually have with a title that is Literature and Revolution is Trotsky's 1924 Literature and Revolution, a very important text, but one that also marks a kind of culmination. There are already conversations across China, across Central Asia, across the Middle East, starting in the late 19th century. We know the Chinese intellectual and activist Lu Xun gives a lecture in 1927, kind of after Trotsky's work, called Literature in the Times of Revolution. Various Ottoman intellectuals and Central Asian intellectuals are also thinking at the same time about the question of art, culture, language itself, and the question of revolution. And we might remember here that revolutions in writing systems across the world, many of which are happening in the early 20th century, are tied to this question of revolution being brought about at the level of culture before it becomes political. In Trotsky's 1924 Literature and Revolution, he attempts to tease out what is the relationship of literature to a revolutionary society. If literature is the province of the bourgeoisie, how do we imagine a society in which the proletariat might be in control? And will that proletariat have a literature, and will that literature be revolutionary? Trotsky, Xun, and others pointed out that there was no revolutionary literature to date, they argued, because there were no revolutionaries who were writing literature. And I think that should give us pause as we circle back and think about the 17th century moment, to think about when are revolutionaries sufficiently revolutionary enough to produce what we might recognize as a revolutionary literature or art. And it will come as no surprise that many of the modernist movements in literature and the arts that follow from the 19 teens and 1920s in the wake really of the First World War are these moments of cultural disruption, right? You might think here of modernism as a literary movement. You might think of surrealism. You might think of cubism. These ideas of breaking the plane, breaking how we see the world around us in these fundamentally disruptive ways as indices of a kind of revolutionary art. But it seems to me that Trotsky's question, in some ways, is a question that haunts literary criticism to date and gets imported backwards for also thinking about the early modern period, because it asks whether literature is simply a reflector of revolution, of sociopolitical revolution, or whether literature and the arts can precipitate sociopolitical revolution, right? Which one produces the other one? Do we have to already be revolutionary in mindset, or do we have to actually think about bringing about revolution with our work? It's interesting that the notion of a revolutionary literature has been applied, or was applied initially by largely Marxist critics, to the early modern period, and I am coming to Milton very soon. This question of whether form can be political, whether there is a politics to form, do specific aesthetic and literary forms necessarily point us towards a progressive or reactionary politics? Do artists, authors, and critics alike imagine their own revolutionary identity before they write? Or do we describe their work as revolutionary in a post facto sense? In other words, does literary and cultural history produce revolutionaries in hindsight, or do they understand their own work to be revolutionary in the moment? Marxism certainly was a revolutionary framework, critically, politically, culturally. And we might think here of kind of important historians and literary critics. I'm thinking here of Christopher Hill, Nigel Smith, who've written books that speak specifically of the conjunction here in the title of Nigel Smith's book, Literature and Revolution in England. And these frameworks of applying the language of revolution in really a post-20th century sense to thinking about revolutionary change in literature in the early modern period is something that we've seen, I think, a lot of, certainly in the last 40 or 50 years. As a small footnote, I just want to note too that decolonization in the 20th century brings with it a new kind of language of revolution, thinking of the overthrow of empire as a different and new kind of revolution that's pretty crucial. Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism ends with a reminder and a call to revolution, to the vision of a classless and utopian society, even though it goes all the way back to the origins of humanism in Europe in the early modern period. I want to wind up my remarks today by beginning by simply turning to two sets of examples, I think, that can help us hold together this conjunction between a 17th century moment of semantic origin and a 20th century critical historiographic framework that interact, I think, in dynamic ways in various disciplines. By noticing that to think about revolution in literary terms is to think about questions of rhetoric, genre, form, audience. And one of the ways in which we can do that is to look at things like polemic and pamphlets, and on the one hand, and to look at imaginative literature of forms like novels and poems on the other. So two examples to wind up. One, of course, is to think of the great revolutionary writer of the English 17th century, John Milton, whose very important pamphlets and whose prose for much of the middle of the 17th century constitutes both revolutionary writing, that is to say, writing that wants to bring about revolution, and writing that registers ongoing revolution. And we might think here of, most famously perhaps, Iconoclastes, Milton's defense of the execution of Charles I. We might think of his 5 anti-prelatical tracts, which are intended to bring about revolution. We might think about Areopagitica, a work that thinks about the capacity of literature to both reflect and bring about change. Not to mention, of course, the long poems, but to think here specifically about the function of prose in the political sphere and its revolutionary force. The other example I want to end with, actually, perhaps as a way of passing the baton here to Aaron, is to think about the significance of poetry and documentary prose during the Arab Spring, a very kind of contemporary revolution in which literature and the arts played a really crucial role. We might think about the huge outpouring of literature in Egypt in the wake of Tahrir Square. I'm thinking here of a novel like Mona Prince's Revolution is My Name, or Adaf Suwaif's Cairo, My City, Our Revolution, work works that use that word in their title to document and remind us in literary terms of what took place, even though we have many other kinds of media recordings of that moment. We might think also of the chanting and singing of poems and songs in Tunisia, in Syria, and elsewhere as ways of producing communal forms of revolution that are indexed through through shared cultural production. And perhaps I think the most complicated and interesting example that has not been studied very much is the use by ISIS, actually, of classical Arabic poetry as the ground for a new jihadi poetics that held together these communities that were variously in exile and on the run, right? So thinking about the place there of revolution quite literally as a literary return to a past in order to produce and create a new kind of community for the future. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Eric.
So as is probably clear, I'm something of an invited interloper in this group. In one way or another, all of my co-panelists are specialists in early modern Europe. I'm primarily a historian of the modern Middle East. And I happen to be living in Cairo, doing research for my doctoral dissertation when the mass popular movements variously dubbed the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings, or the revolutions of 2011 began. So while my colleagues here are far better equipped than I am to speak about the concept and practices of revolution in at least one key historical era of its emergence, I'm going to share some thoughts based on my own research on mass politics in the Arab world and my firsthand experiences of 2011 about revolution in this much more recent past. And the general idea I'm going to emphasize in the 10 minutes I have is that revolution is comparative. Revolutions as a form of political practice both rely upon and invite multiple forms of comparison. And recognizing these comparative qualities may help us to think better about the tensions and contradictions that tend to characterize revolutionary moments. Before proceeding, I'd like to draw your attention to the double meaning of the question that's actually framing this panel. What is revolution? So the question can be understood both as one of definition, in other words, what are the defining qualities and characteristics of revolution, but also as one of taxonomy. What is revolution and what isn't? And almost from the beginning, particularly outside the region itself, much of the commentary and analysis of the popular movements erupting across the Arab world in 2011 was preoccupied in with some version of this latter question. So my goal in these opening remarks is not so much to come down on one side or the other, though I can do that later on if people would like, but to explore some of the implications of the question for how we might think about revolution today. And to begin, I'm going to offer a very quick refresher on the events of 2011, since for those of you who didn't experience them firsthand, they may now be somewhat hazy. And I realize following Aisha and Jason's comments that there's sort of no way of doing this without implying something about my own thinking about what took place, of course. But by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, there were many reasons for very large numbers of people across the Arab world to be deeply dissatisfied by the ruling regimes in their respective countries. In many of these states, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, a single aging individual had sat atop the existing political order for several decades. And in several others, most notably Syria, the outward trappings of a republican system had given way to a hereditary dynasty, an arrangement the Egyptian political theorist Sa'ad Ibrahim once called Gumlukiya, which is a kind of clever mashup of the Arabic words for republic and monarchy. For several decades, these regimes had pursued economic policies of a broadly neoliberal character that, in the name of attracting investment and promoting market freedoms, dismantled public services and social safety nets dating back to the 50s and 60s, and thereby turbocharged existing forms of inequality. To contain and suppress the popular discontent resulting from these arrangements, all of these regimes coupled economic liberalization with more violent and extensive techniques of political repression. There was, in other words, plenty to be unhappy about, but until 2011, the overwhelming consensus of expert opinion was that significant change was unlikely. Political scientists in my field of Middle East studies spent the early 2000s producing endless theories of what they called durable authoritarianism, and many qualitative social scientists in history, sociology, and anthropology basically abandoned the study of formal politics and large-scale movements in favor of mundane acts of resistance and the micropolitics of everyday life. In retrospect, there were ample precedents for what was about to take place, but in the prevailing climate of low expectations, they did not receive much attention. And then on December 17th, 2010, a poor street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi in the provincial Tunisian city of Sidi Bouzid, in a dramatic act of protest against the confiscation of his produce cart for operating without a license, doused himself in petroleum and lit himself on fire on the steps of the provincial headquarters. The incident provoked protests in the city of Sidi Bouzid, and as was typical of the Tunisian regime at the time, the police responded with overwhelming force. But the protests continued, and as photos and videos of clashes with security forces began to circulate on social media, the demonstrations spread to other provincial towns and cities, and then to the capital of Tunis. Undeterred by the ruling regime's repressive tactics, the crowds shouting the rhythmic slogan, Shab, Yurid, Isqat, and Nizam, the people want the overthrow of the regime, continued to grow. And on January 14th, 2011, the 75-year-old president Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, who had ruled since 1987, capitulated and fled the country for Riyadh. This stunning turn of events electrified the region, and within a matter of weeks, and in a few cases days, protests chanting the same slogan had begun to occupy public spaces in Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria. I'm going to focus in what follows on Egypt, but to zoom quickly forward, right, by the late spring, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, Muammar al-Qaddafi of Libya, Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen had all been forced out of office. With significant military support from neighboring Saudi Arabia, the uprising in Bahrain was crushed, and the protest movement in Syria had morphed into a brutally violent civil war that would ultimately fail, at least to date, to oust Bashar al-Assad. Okay, so turning to Egypt, the question that was everywhere in local media, in everyday conversations in street cafes, and in foreign political analysis in the days following Ben Ali's resignation was whether what was quickly dubbed the Tunisian Revolution might spread. This first comparative question, is Egypt like Tunisia, quickly inspired a range of others. And this striking piece of conceptual art that I'll share from the culture and arts magazine Badoon offers some sense of the sweep and intensity of the comparative impulse that characterized this moment. Sort of endless headlines asking questions about whether one country was in some way like another. Now, the satirical intent of this compendium was to point up a certain kind of political work that many of these comparisons were doing. In many instances, the point of the headlines and the analyses that followed them was to stress in one way or another the limited horizons for significant change in Egypt or other parts of the Arab world. And in many such accounts, the comparison was framed in such a way as to deny the possibility that anything notably new was taking place, and thereby to claim that the outcomes were already knowable via prior histories of other places. As a witty rejoinder to this kind of defeatist exceptionalism, the catalog of comparisons was effective and compelling. But at the same time, the critical send-up of these specific comparisons risks drawing our attention away from the inherently comparative character of all revolutions, even the earliest ones, but especially those that have occurred since the concept was well established in the world. And so in sort of opening up conversation with my early modernist colleagues here, I'd like to offer some quick thoughts about the comparative dimensions of the Egyptian revolution of 2011 along three different axes I'll call social, spatial, and temporal, although all of those are kind of sloppy. So along the first axis, we might consider more closely the central slogan of the protests, the people want the overthrow of the regime. In the remarkably capacious category, Ashab, the people, lay a strong claim to some deeply felt commensurability of experience across broad swaths of Egyptian society that under many other circumstances might have struggled to relate to each other. It's this kind of comparison, call it the comparison of collective action, that is necessarily characteristic, I'd suggest, of all mass movements, revolutionary or otherwise. And indeed, we might chart the trajectory of any such movement by exploring how its organizing social categories do or don't hold together. In this instance, the range of grievances against Hosni Mubarak and his inner circle was so extensive that it was able to, that category was able to unify a remarkably diverse array of groups and tendencies around a relatively narrow framing of the overthrow of the regime, something akin to the kind of simplistic conception of political revolution that Jason was responding to in his remarks, kind of rapid regime change. But once the upper ranks of the military had made the calculation that they were better off pushing Mubarak to resign on February 11th, 2011, the political field became far more fractious, and the coherence of the people started to kind of dissolve. Along the spatial axis, the uprisings had an obviously wave-like character. The commonly assigned collective label, Arab Spring, was itself a comparative reference to other moments of geographically mobile uprisings. And indeed, we should take notice that for centuries now, revolutions have arrived in periodic bursts across space. In 2011, as in other such moments, the late 18th century, 1848, 1905, 1919, and so on, comparisons across global space played a pivotal role in allowing historical actors to envision new possibilities for themselves. At the same time, those spatial comparisons represented constraints of their own. I'll mention just two here. So first, the spectacularly mobile character of the uprisings represented a real hazard for every regime in the region and helps to explain why those countries that did not see large-scale protests in early 2011, most notably Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, invested so heavily in backing armed repression of these popular movements even beyond their own borders. Second, the way the movements traveled may have helped to privilege the national scale as the primary target of the activist crowds. In other words, the protests in Egypt focused overwhelmingly on the central government, understood as the government of Egypt, and had surprisingly little to say about provincial and local institutions that arguably have had at least as much bearing on people's everyday lives. And finally, and perhaps most obviously, once the concept exists in the world, the very invocation of revolution at least implies, and quite often directly entails, comparison with past events that have carried the same name. This lends the concept an often unremarked contradictory character, although Aisha in some sense referred to this with her opening remarks about its lexical history. So it is commonly understood to imply the advent of the new, but its very use entails a comparison with what has already taken place. At the level of political practice, this means crucially that in moments like 2011, large numbers of people who have never met each other or planned in advance carry with them a knowledge of how to do revolution. Many of the embodied practices of 2011 reworked repertoires of protest with a very long history, albeit in new ways. But here again, that knowledge of prior moments of revolution, a kind of periodic continuum, may have burdened as much as enabled the transformative possibilities that were emerging. So what I'm suggesting is that, given that many of the remarks today are about this kind of formative moment of the concept's emergence, whether thinking closer to the present allows us to sort of wonder about whether the concept has come to stand in the way of thinking about other possibilities that might actually be more revolutionary than revolution. So I'll stop there.
Well, this is a wonderful topic and so good to think with, as we've already heard in Jason, Aisha's, and Aaron's fascinating contributions. I take my task to be twofold. First, to reference historical sociology and revolution more generally, throw in some more disciplinary variety for our discussion. And second, to raise a question or problem that especially preoccupies me, something that I'd like to throw into our intellectual stone soup here. Steve Pinkus's introduction already neatly opened the way for the disciplinary piece, and no wonder I would characterize Steve as a social science historian, one who moves effortlessly and impressively between history and social science disciplines on the question of revolution. So his thumbnail summary of general academic positions canvassed 4 approaches: 1, modernization theory; 2, class-based analyses; 3, structural changes in polities or polity-centric approaches; and 4, natural histories or revolutionary life cycles. Very helpful starting point. Let me make 2 tweaks or 2 friendly amendments, or at least I think they're friendly. We'll see what you all think. The first is that these approaches have very different levels of explanatory ambition, and I think that that matters. 3 of them tend to seek to capture the whole of revolutionary processes under a singular, conceptually coherent heading. Modernization theory argued that a whole series of interlocked processes undermined old-style societies and gave rise to new. Class-based or neo-Marxian takes focused on revolutionary transitions between modes of economic production. Natural history life cycle approaches, which were always more descriptive of social patterns and less explicitly explanatory, tried to identify the analytical narratives of revolutions from causes through processes and outcomes. But I think what Steve characterized as structural changes in polities and in sociology is often referred to as the polity or state-centric approach focuses on one dimension in one variable or one region of the revolutionary process, even narrowing within that, tending to narrow to state breakdown. That might be demographic and ideological, as in Jack Goldstone's Revolution and Rebellion in the early modern world. It might be fiscal driven by wars, as in Theda Skocpol's States and Social Revolutions. It might be politico-familial, as in my Familial State book, which argued that patriarchal patrimonial modes of rule first fostered and then undermined metropolitan European state formation and empire and left profound traces in revolutions. Whatever the authors say about this sort of style of work, and some make very big claims, at least in certain moods, the polity-centric or state-centric approach is typically more intellectually modest because it highlights a contribution to the inception, progress, or outcomes of political revolutions rather than the whole shebang, if you will. Ergo, in some hands, it dovetails with one of the other more totalizing explanations. For example, you can have a hybrid approach to revolutions that focuses on class, but sees the breakdown of a class state to have its own logic and timing. And we see this style of argument in, for example, Mark Gould's Revolution and the Development of Capitalism, or Robert Brenner's Merchants and Revolution, with respect to the English Revolution in both cases, or obviously a great deal of writing on the French Revolution. Why has historical sociology, why have these explanations tended to narrow over time in this way? Well, I think part of what lay behind this involves what has already been referenced, which is the enormously different processual timescales and interconnections between or among revolutions. For example, the lightning fast French Revolution taking a mere decade or so compared to the multi-decade Chinese Revolution. Saussurean snapshots or stage sequential thinking won't readily capture such elongated historical processes. They start to resemble the vexed transitional category of merchant capitalism, which historically widens, widens, and widens. But it also reflects a much broader shift in not just historical sociology, but social science more generally, away from Comtean claims to law-like positivist explanation on the one hand, to interdependent mechanisms based or sometimes true theory, quote unquote, arguments on the other. And this has been obviously a massive long-term intellectual movement. It tends to cohabit with a more rigorous approach to causality and causal claims, which have become increasingly conceptually detailed and even quantified. Like it or not, that is where much of the harder social sciences have shifted. And perhaps that explains in part the pleasure I feel today at being invited to extend beyond those disciplinary strictures. Not that I always personally hew to them, but of course, those expectations have really transformed my field, teaching, graduate training, et cetera. So they very much bound what I do. The Second Amendment is that I think there is a fifth historical sociological approach to revolution, which I would dub the eco-political. Jason Moore, sociologist at Binghamton, argues, for example, that climatological shifts are deeply entwined with the rise and fall of politico, economic, and familial reproductive regimes. What this would mean is that we can't understand any of the early modern European revolutions, England's included, without situating them squarely in the Little Ice Age, roughly late 13th century to early 19th. Moore's timeline for the broader causal argument would therefore begin in 1257 with one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the Holocene epoch. Its contribution to global cooling, starting in the second half of the 13th century, the spread of pathogens, e.g. the Black Death, onto hungry and weakened populations, and the rebalancing of political land labor regimes in Europe. Man in this approach is very much also part of nature. This approach is clearly not foreign to historians, I'm sure you would tell me, who argued over a related version during one slice of the famous Brenner debate. But it now involves dialogues or attended dialogues with geologists, biologists, climate specialists, as well as conversations across history and the social sciences. As an emergent form of interdisciplinary knowledge, which is very challenging, I think, and sometimes frightening, it will have implications for our collective thinking about the relationship among the environment, contemporary reproductive crises in Europe, Asia, the Americas, and elsewhere, mass migration patterns, new pathogens like COVID, and political destabilization. The emergent general crisis of the 20th century, question mark. Finally, the issue question that I would like to put on the table actually returns in a funny way to Crane Brinton, problematical continuities and the specificity of what Crane Brinton called the Great Revolutions or the broader global early modern revolutionary era. And I think what is at stake here is our historical focus on the massive transformations marked out by transitions to modernity, quote unquote, and what Jürgen Habermas called the unfinished project of modernity. In a forthcoming paper, the historical sociologist Isaac Reed and I argue that this has been represented as, in part, a politico-cultural process of exit from a political community of a more tribal, feudal, or monarchical caste, in which the legitimacy of the state is imagined to have been constituted by its linkage to the king's household, metonymical linkage as well. In the place of the servant of the king's household, the modern state offers us the civil servant of the people. But here's the rub. Modern politics, including the politics of the US today, has seldom, if ever, succeeded in emancipating itself from these ostensibly pre-modern forms. For example, the modern political condition still involves the gendered representations of states, practices of patrimonial power that organize the extension of rule, the privileging by the state of certain formats of male power and authority in the family, and a tendency to associate masculinity with public glory and femininity with domesticity. Although they are in principle included in the modern political body, women are recurrently in practice relegated, even forcibly, to the domestic or private sphere. Does this indicate that the revolutionary character of the project of modernity is somehow unfinished and that the guarantees of the liberal nation state need to be extended to previously excluded persons? Or does it point to a more fundamental, queasier crisis of modernity, whose symbolics of rule are derived from a struggle of citizen brothers against father kings and emperors, thereby underwritten by the sexual contract? It certainly, in either case, argues against easy divisions of pre-modern and modern and interstitial revolutionary transitions between these stages. And I say this with great discomfort because, of course, my own work actually is informed by those distinctions. I'm coming to very conclusion here. It may be surprising, therefore, that throughout my career, at least, I've continued to find Max Weber's conceptualization of transitions to modernity to be useful. This is, of course, because it includes many messy facets. The sheer variety of pre-modern formats of rule, including a huge set of patriarchal and patrimonial political systems. Second, the uneven emergence of bureaucratic rule across the globe as a competing way to organize politics. And finally, as Isaac Reed and I argue, the disruptive and emotionally charged recurrence of deviations from the rational legal bureaucratic norm as vital elements in modern politics. Weber's work is, of course, not the last word, but it continues to provide a touchstone and a point of opposition for theoretical contestation for several generations of scholars who bring interest in feminist politics to conventional questions about state building, capitalism, modernity, and revolution. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to all of our panelists for fulfilling my promise that they would be provocative and exciting. I guess, I mean, I'm sure for the entire audience, these presentations provoked lots and lots of questions. I guess I wanted to start by asking, well, I sort of have three questions that I want to ask. Maybe the place to start off a little bit is where Julia ended with about messiness and revolution. That is to say, It strikes me that in a variety of ways, all of our speakers talked about messiness in different ways, messiness, complications, etc. The question is that I wanted to ask the panelists is how much continuity, either formal in terms of literary form or in terms of political or social form, can one have and still think about a revolutionary transformation? And I guess I wanted to sort of think about that because one of the implications, I mean, it strikes me that you've all sort of raised this, but one of the things that you've also talked about is kind of criticizing, and this is where Jason started, criticizing a kind of narrow, simple-minded political definition of revolution. If one gets rid of that, and one can sort of see the revolutionary transformations in different spheres. How much can one talk about revolutions and say, yeah, what the larger point that Julia makes is right, that that a kind of an old style modernization, that there was once a period which was pre-modern, and now through revolutionary transformation we have entered the modern. That's clearly a sort of black and white formulation, which I don't think any of us would agree with. But how much change? What kind of continuities can we allow for and say that there's still been revolutionary change?
Maybe I'll go out on a limb here and say, as somebody who regularly teaches classes on the Renaissance and the early modern and thinks about this question of, how much, when can we talk about rupture? And is rupture and revolution really the same thing? And while I think that the temptation to want to think about long-term gradual revolution, that multiple cycles perhaps are all well taken, there's some way in which revolution does need to feature rupture of some kind or disruption of some kind. And while I think we can recognize a background of forms of continuity in various realms, to my mind, to sort of name something as a revolution, I think we have to be able to identify at least some vectors of rupture, which means breaking. That's not to say that those forms of breaking don't return to something prior to what was before, or don't in other ways sustain, social political forms that also exist in the background. But I think it is to say that there does need to be some sense in which there is pretty fundamental rupture. So maybe putting out that provocation, I will let my other panelists disagree with that.
Can I just quickly agree with it instead and say, and make kind of just throw out something supplementary, which is to say, I absolutely do agree with it. I know it comes with the whole freight of assumptions about unevenness, for example, and reaction and so on. But it's potentially quite a wide thing to think about, connecting us with the other forms of revolution besides political revolution, such as the notion of paradigm and Kuhnian scientific revolutions. So I sign on to that general project. Of course, leaves open the question of what kind of rupture and how do we establish them, et cetera. But yes.
And one way that I would think about that is that there's maybe it's a sort of tipping point notion and a contemporary awareness. There are lots of modes of political behavior in the early modern period that are clearly long and continuous. I mean, the printing happens, there's news, and petitioning happens. Petitioning has always happened, but there's a process by which that changes, and at some point, and perhaps multiple points, this is a kind of staggered. But there are kind of moments where the contemporaries say, "Whoa, something's kind of weird is happening here. We seem to have shifted somewhat. This looks ostensibly familiar, and now suddenly is not familiar." And in the history of petitioning, you would say the very early 1620s, 1621, 1624. some sort of pretty fundamental sea change happens, and they notice it, and they start then grappling with it. But you then get another one in 1649 or 1651, something kind of, you know, so it's a kind of steps noticed by them that relate to what is ostensibly a kind of stable, continual, accepted practice, petitioning or printing something. That would be my.
I was going to say, I mean, because we leapt from the 17th century to the early 21st, that, you know, one of the works that I found pretty consistently useful for thinking about this is Bill Sewell's classic essay on the storming of the Bastille as a historical event, and thinking about events as transformations of structures. And I think part of the reason why you know, the move that all of us in different ways are making kind of beyond narrowly political conceptions, even of political revolutions, is that often those kinds of changes register in other domains and areas of experience. So we might think about how kind of changes in thinking register in shifts of lexical categories, like the concept of revolution itself, and the way that it, you know, its meanings can be traced through shifts, in the way that Aisha did at the beginning of her talk, is actually registering historically significant transformations in kind of common fields of understanding at the level of lexical categories. And I guess coming with that, you know, at the experiential level, I think that many of the moments that have been the foci of sustained study of revolution have been ones in which there has been kind of sufficient suspension of people's expectations about what's supposed to be happening, that there is real palpable uncertainty that allows for certain new things to happen. And I mean, I when Steve and I were talking about that panel a couple of weeks ago, I described a sort of weird passing moment about a month after Mubarak stepped down in Egypt, where the country was about to vote, and it was going to be the first experience of voting in a free election that basically any living person in Egypt had ever had. And it was on a set of relatively minor seeming modifications to the constitution to lend kind of legal formality to a period of transition. But because no one in the country had voted in a free election, which was, you know, voting in an election doesn't seem like a particularly revolutionary thing, what was particularly striking was that no one had an established position on what to do. And so there were just these kind of free-form debates among strangers in the street, thinking about what that might look like. And so I think, you know, in terms of the research agendas that different people are talking about, like understanding when and how those things are happening often requires us to kind of look outside the domain of formal politics itself.
I might just quickly follow up there to say, as I was thinking about this conversation, I found myself thinking, is the question not what is revolution, but when is revolution? Because I think much of what we're all saying is there are tipping points, but there are events or actions that are retrospectively identified as these starting points, right? But then if you zoom out and want to take a historiographical view, then you say, oh, well, there was all this structural change that laid the foundation for this revolution before. And so that event was not the event. The revolution really started, you know, before we even knew it was starting. And so I do think that the question of when is revolution is actually sort of crucial to whether we privilege moments of rupture or these kinds of gradual sort of shifts that happen over time.
So can I ask one other question? Then we really should have thrown it open to the audience. Only elliptically has the concept of nation come up in this discussion. It came up twice, once in the end of Julia's remarks explicitly, and once implicitly by Aisha's invocation of Aimé Césaire. Now, controversially, Césaire, I'm sort of thinking about Eric Williams's sort of famous quiet criticism of Aimé Césaire. Well, not so famous, but quiet criticism of Aimé Césaire, in which, while ostensibly supporting Césaire, he quietly denounced him as a nationalist, because in his view, négritude was simply the concept of post-colonial négritude was simply another word for nation. And the question that I want to sort of ask is, does revolution imply nation, both as the object of study, that is to say, the way that Aaron talked about the concept of the people, right? And as outcome, right? As creating, this is kind of the older literature on the French Revolution said, that the French Revolution created the French nation, right? So what does one think? Is nation still an important, is it possible to think about revolution? And even if one, should say, even if one broadens the concept of revolution to include something like the Protestant Reformation, as Stephen Osmond long ago said, it was also national, right? The idea was that the Protestant Reformation created a homogeneous, at least in imaginative sense, people who had a new but relatively uniform relationship with God.
Yeah, I guess I have a question, I guess it could be for everyone, but following up on your question, but also for you, Steve, if you would like to not just ask questions, but also try to answer your question as well, which is, do you mean most specifically the inception of the dyad of, on the one hand, the system of nation states, on the other hand, the category and institutionalization of the rights-bearing individual? That linkage that Emil Durkheim took to be definitive of modernity, if you will. Norbert Elias, right, makes this enormously central in his book on the civilizing process and so on. But it's certainly questioned by people who would take the category of rights to be much longer and historically that would try to make firm distinctions between active rights and passive rights, et cetera. Maybe a recent example of this is Wen-Kai Hu's book, Public Interest and State Legitimation, which is on early modern Japan and China. In a way, that kind of restates this whole conundrum of categories that we're kind of kicking around here. But I think it still has, that this distinction still has life in it.
Alongside nation, the other word that didn't come up that I would have thought would come up is empire, because I do think that something about the question of revolution exists in that place between the imperial and the national. And I think the question of decolonization, for instance, is tied up with that as well. And I wonder, and this is just kind of wondering, whether we don't want to talk about nation right now in this particular political moment, because it feels so complicatedly fraught, that there was a moment, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, even, when the nation still held out the promise of a kind of secular multiplicity. And I think the return in some ways to a much more homogeneous, restricted version of who gets to be in a nation in this particular moment, I think makes I think many of us uneasy to talk about that. And Steve, you brought up Orban, for instance, in your opening remarks. And I think that this question of, the right-wing revolution, that is a real question that we are watching happen today. Will that count as a revolution in 20 years? And will that be associated with nation, with a kind of recovery, speaking of revolution as return, right? To recovery of a certain imagining of a 19th century modality of nation? I think that's a real question, but it is absolutely one that is tied up with imperial desire. Much of the kind of one phase of early modern conversation around the emergence of nations had to do with, do nations emerge from empires, right? Does imperial desire in some sense produce the nation? And I think that is a crucial question for thinking about notions of revolution as well.
Two quick things. One, this is, I think I wasn't I was being too cryptic, but I mean, this was a version of what I was saying in my spatial remarks, that basically the kind of form of movement was from one nation state to another, and that certainly in Egypt, where there is a kind of very long, deep-seated kind of coherence of national space, that association between revolution and nation did, in really dramatic ways, seem to kind of restrict the range of areas in which large numbers of people were willing to think about what change would look like. On the other hand, I would just point out, and my friend, colleague, former supervisor Mano Goswami has been working for a very long time on a book about this, and other people have too. There are, in fact, long important histories of revolutionary internationalism and moments in which revolutionary movements did actively kind of think beyond those frames. And I think that this is, as Aisha was suggesting, a kind of running tension in scholarship on a lot of the post-colonial world. I think because of the moment of hard exclusionary nationalisms that we're living through right now, there has been a tendency, I think, to want to distance scholarship from the association between revolutionary politics and nationalism. And the fact is that in many parts of the world, nationalism did end up becoming the kind of primary vector for mass politics, and that tendency had contained contradictory possibilities. And I think certainly in my field, there's been a wave of very strange scholarship trying to kind of rewrite. I mean, on the anniversaries of the 1919 revolutions, to try to kind of rewrite these histories as non-national uprisings in ways that are very bizarre if one knows anything about sort of what led up to them and what they were advocating for.
I think nation is a relevant category in this context, but not necessarily dominant. I think it gets invoked, but perhaps in ways that are contested. So in a sense, that the people who I think of as being partakers of or participants in the revolutions as I think we could usefully see them are sometimes thinking in ways that involve invoking conscious invocation of the nation, but not always. And actually sometimes that invocation of the nation in connection with the kind of revolutionary things that I think that we can see them doing. Sometimes their invocations of nation provoke others who are also revolutionaries to clarify that they're not actually, or reveal that others are not really invoking nation. So I think in that sense, I think the issue of nation becomes a contested part of the revolution in terms of whether or not it is central and should be central. So that there's a question mark around it. So it's an issue for them, for sure, in kind of entangled with the revolutions. But it's not that they instinctively think nation. Revolutionaries think like nation, about nations.
Okay. Well, I'm sure all of this, at least in me, has provoked even more questions, but I think we should perhaps turn the querying away from ourselves, or towards ourselves maybe, but from the audience. So
we do have a couple. Yeah, we do have a couple questions in the chat, Steve. I could read. The first one is, I wonder how much something being a revolution depends upon contemporary saying that one is happening.
I certainly think that their awareness is pretty, their perspective is a vital part of how we should and could calibrate what's going on. I think it's a vital marker, but not to the exclusion of other things. I mean, in a sense, I think we can see things. I think it is legitimate for us to see phenomena as with clarity that they don't quite have. But I would put in the mix that their perspective is often pretty vital.
Could I sort of just push a little bit on this and just sort of, I mean, if one takes Aisha's lexical point seriously, does this then mean that it's inconceivable to imagine revolution happening before the 13th century?
I mean, I have two thoughts about this, Steve. One is revolution can be a heuristic category that we apply, to anything we decide is a revolution based on certain criteria. And then there is a notion of revolution, which is, comes through a sort of self-reflexive identification at any given point of time, right? And I'll just sort of say here, I mean, Aaron and I are having a side conversation in the chat about the fact that there have been many moments in which contemporaries understand or want to understand as revolutionary that historians or history much later has not understood to be revolutionary, and that bears thinking too, right? Because you can choose to say, well, now this is going to be a revolution, and then it isn't. I mean, January 6th is sort of a great example of that, right? For some people, that was going to be the moment of overthrow, but I'm going to pass it to Aaron to talk about that amazing image that he has put up next to him.
So yeah, I mean, just to this point, and I mean, this raises another issue that it's sort of noticeable that none of us have yet touched, which has to do with sort of the role of violence in what does or doesn't get called revolution. So this image is from the cover of one of the most popular magazines in Egypt in 1951, in a moment in which there was a mass armed insurgency in the eastern part of the country around the Suez Canal zone, that was described by contemporaries over and over again as a revolution. So in this image, the sword that is being wielded to chop off the head of Great Britain, it has the Arabic word for revolution written on it. And when a military coup calling itself a revolution came to power 6 months later in July of 1952, it became the revolution. And this moment has basically been kind of expunged from most histories of modern Egypt. So there are these kind of interesting moments in which the category is invoked and thought with and used, in which retrospectively it is not applied.
We can go to the next question then, is a big picture question. Where do the economic and environmental revolutions fit into this debate? For example, when we shift to environmental models, the relationship between the British agricultural and industrial revolutions, can we develop parallels and points of divergence between the socio-political science models of rupture and the economic models of takeoff, or between the different counter-history methods that revise chronologies and causalities of change?
Could I just say that I think these are a great set of questions, really exciting. They kind of shift the terrain from the emergent sets of analyses or reemergent that I was mentioning, in which climatological, ecological, epidemiological causes of political revolutions are taken into account more theoretically and systematically, to this parallel among types or forms of revolution that are stretch beyond the political and the social, to include, the scientific revolutions, agricultural, et cetera. I think this is great. It does prompt us to retreat from some idear causal approaches and delimitations to again open up into messier territory, but I completely support that move. What do the rest of you think?
I've been thinking about this a lot in relation to our event this evening. And it actually, there's an earlier question in the chat about where's Christopher Hill in this, And in a sense, I think my comment about Raymond Williams is, I'm personally very comfortable with the idea that we should think about the economic stuff. We shouldn't just separate, just treat politics as if there's no connection with economic stuff. So, positing connections across from economy and indeed environment. But the problem with sometimes how that's done, Christopher Hill, is it just becomes this kind of blunt causal thing. Economic change drives, and that's why I seem to me Raymond Williams, just as an example, is just more satisfactory in how he does it. And it seems to me that we can think about connections and kind of commonalities across from economic and political revolutions. I mean, there's clearly some sort of profound economic change happening alongside or proximate to the political revolution that I think is happening over a protracted period. It's the same protracted, more or less the same protracted period, or they're happening together. And I think that we can think about ways in which they share common things, and in that sense are coming from similar places or involve similar types of phenomena, actually, or there are shared phenomena amongst the rise of capitalism or the kind of development of capitalism and the political revolution. But it's not, I don't think we can usefully, or we can too simply think about that as causal. One is the response to the other. I think that they are both happening together, and we can think about what links them usefully. I mean, there was this really interesting kind of notion that an informational revolution is crucial to the political revolution that as I'm positing it, I would see that as kind of constitutive. And you can see that an informational revolution is also part of what happens, is constitutive of the development of capitalism as that kind of profound change. So that's one way, just an example of how you can make these connections. So I think we should make these connections, but it's how we do it that's the challenge.
And of course, Aaron, I do remember that the Arab Spring was, of course, posited on the information, the ability to share information in new ways across social media. So
yes, although I mean, it turns out that at the level of organizing, I mean, one of the interesting things there is that those media in some ways had more significance for audiences outside the spaces in which the uprisings were happening, and I mean, which had to do with an awareness of the ways in which geopolitics might actually shape the outcomes. But a lot of the organizing that was being done was happening, with Xerox flyers and much older forms of media, and in fact, there were kind of moments where people watched, like television programs played an important role. So. Yes, and these things always get kind of layered in interesting ways.
Well, seeing no other questions, I think it's time for us to move to our breakout session for the graduate students and early career researchers. But first, let's thank the panelists. Thank Steve for bringing this amazing group together. Really appreciate all that you put into today. So many wonderful perspectives shared. I really love the cross-disciplinary perspective on the day and on this question, which I think we have not answered today, but we certainly have illuminated a lot of amazing thoughts. So thank you so much to our panelists and to the audience. If you want to stay on with us, there is a breakout room. You're allowed to. You should be able to choose for yourself how to join that room on the bottom panel. Just click on the words breakout room, and it will whisk you in there. And I will do that for the panelists momentarily. So thank you all.